Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving into some fascinating insights from Paul's letter to Titus. These come from a recent meditation by the Melbourne City Church YouTube channel. And our mission really for this deep dive, it's to pull out some concrete goals for how we can grow, as individuals and how we fill our roles in our communities. The central theme that really jumped out, it argues that this call to moral accountability, it isn't just for adults. It's seen as fundamental, right, from the earliest stages of life.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here, I think, is how these, ancient teachings offer surprisingly practical guidance for modern life. They show us how believers might navigate some complex relationships, both, as citizens within a nation, but also in the closer dynamics of community and church life. It's really about building a coherent way of living that impacts, every sphere.
Okay, so how does this actually translate into practical advice? Paul gives Titus some very specific instructions. Let's maybe start with how it advises believers to engage as citizens. The source emphasizes obeying governing authorities and willingly doing what is right. But I'm curious, does it offer guidance beyond just, follow the rules, especially if those rules maybe clash with your beliefs? Or is it suggesting something deeper, like civic engagement?
That's a really good question because the source definitely tries to go deeper than just surface level obedience. It presents a, let's say, distinct theological viewpoint, which is that the authority of earthly nations, even powerful ones back then like Assyria or Babylon, is ultimately seen as permitted, maybe even orchestrated by divine providence. It points to the Old Testament, highlighting instances where God is seen working through empires, even, surprisingly, prophesying King Cyrus of Persia by name hundreds of years before he was born, right there in Isaiah. So that gives a pretty unique lens on history and government. The text highlights that believers should try to embed biblical wisdom into society's laws. So it's not just about personal obedience, it's more about actively contributing to a society where, principles of justice and righteousness can foster a more peaceful life for everyone, which in turn broadens the opportunities for evangelism and positive influence.
By actively shaping society, not just sort of passively existing in it. That's quite a thought. Okay, moving on then. Paul also instructs Titus on teaching believers within the community itself. He advises against thinking you're superior or rebuking others too harshly, reminding us to remember our own past, that we were also foolish once, disobedient, maybe enslaved by passions. But this next insight from the source, it takes a surprisingly sharp turn, doesn't it? Especially on how we view other people's mistakes. There's a phrase coming up that might challenge some assumptions about nurturing and forgiveness.
Yeah, that reflection on our past is vital, but then the source pivots quite sharply. It addresses a common pitfall. Does understanding our own journey mean we should excuse sin in others? And the source is incredibly clear on this. Absolutely not. It warns against that trap of overlooking sins, particularly in young people, with the thought, oh, well, I was like that too, so it's okay. It uses remarkably blunt language here, cautioning that unchecked moral leniency, especially with the young, can lead to really deeply ingrained character flaws. It actually goes so far as to say it can turn them into monsters.
Wow, monsters. Calling children monsters for unaddressed sin is incredibly stark. I imagine that might be quite confronting for many listening. How does the source kind of elaborate on that? Is it talking about inherent evil or more the consequences of just letting behavior go unchecked? And how does this focus on warning everyone, even babies? How does that sit with ideas of innocence or, development?
It is a jarring image, absolutely. But it seems intended to highlight the profound, maybe long-term consequences of neglecting early moral formation. And spiritual discipline, too. The source explains it's about the trajectory, where unchecked behavior can lead. The deep dive emphasizes this decisive no to sin applies to everyone, old, young, and yes, even a baby, in terms of their upbringing and the environment created for them. It commands a really resolute rejection of sin and calls taking it lightly absolutely not biblical. And in this point is underscored by what it describes as God's own unyielding stance against sin, shown most powerfully through Jesus Christ's sacrifice. The source even highlights a surprisingly direct approach to conflict within the community. It advocates for clear boundaries. It points to biblical advice, like in Titus itself, suggesting that if someone is divisive, you warn them once, maybe twice, and if they don't listen, have nothing more to do with them. Now, that definitely challenges the common idea that within the church, or maybe any close group, it's always about endless, unconditional acceptance, no matter what. The Bible, according to this source, is resolute about drawing lines when it comes to sin. It even attributes the decline of some early churches, like those in Asia Minor, partly to losing that vigilance against sin. and failing to pass down God's word correctly to the next generation.
So, okay, what does all this mean for you listening right now? This deep dive really forces us to reflect, doesn't it, on our own attitudes towards sin and moral accountability, both personally and in how we engage with other people. It sounds like a path that requires real care, real alertness, and it probably clashes often with the world's more lenient values.
Exactly. And this brings us to a crucial point for reflection. How resolute are you about sin in your daily life? And when you see it in others, maybe particularly in children or those you have influence over. The source's final challenging thought is really for us to actively strive to grow into the image of saints God dreamed of. Always remembering that this warning against sin isn't just for adults, and working diligently, consciously to implant biblical values about moral courage and accountability deep in the hearts of the next generation.